We started a second organisation called Aegis, which is a genocide prevention organisation as a part of that commitment. I just want to mention two things about Aegis, and which I think are relevant to this evening. Let me go to 1994. Genocide in Rwanda is just about to break out. And there is a young girl who lives in Kigali with her uncle. She was due to go home to her parents for the Easter holidays. But actually, like a lot of 14-year-olds, having had an argument with her mother about something, decided she was not going to do as she was told, and she stayed with her uncle. She didn't know that genocide was about to break out that night. She didn't know that the following morning there would be militia in the front door of the house, which is what happened. She was lucky. She was by the back door with her cousin. The militia came in the front door. Only she and her cousin made it out the back door. They ran down the back of the garden. Her cousin gave her a lift over the wall, but he didn't make it. She was the only one of the family that dropped into the alleyway at the back. She worked out very quickly that it wasn't safe to stay in a neighbourhood where people knew you because there were roadblocks everywhere. And so she moved to another neighbourhood, and she found a woman that would protect her. The woman was also a Tutsi, as she was. She lived in a small courtyard, in a little bedsit, and you couldn't tell that there was actually that little apartment, a little flat on the end, because there were no windows on the road. There was just a door in the inside of the courtyard. It was like an extension, an annex to the house that was on the road. She stayed with the Tutsi woman, who was an older woman, on the basis that the older woman said, "I'm staying in the bedsit, you're going out for food. And I'll protect you, provided you go and find the food." That was the deal. It worked okay until one day she was returning and a girl from school spotted her who knew her and screamed at the top of her voice, "There's a cockroach in the street." And before she knew it, she had a guy running after her with a machete. She ran down the street, into the courtyard, and banged on the door of the bedsit. Now, the woman inside did not have 2 flights of stairs, a parlour, a kitchen, and a scullery to cross to get to the back door to open it. She had to stand up and open the door. It was 6 feet square, this space. The door didn't open. And so she was trapped in the courtyard. Guy with the machete came into the courtyard with the machete above his head. She ran across the courtyard, which is actually not, I mean, it sounds like it was paved, nice and flat and paved, a big courtyard. It wasn't. It was a jumble of oil cans and beams and what. She scrambled over. It was in several levels. She scrambled all over this stuff. The guy behind her. She ran to the far end of the courtyard and down in a blind alley at the end between 2 houses. At the end of the blind alley was a tin door with corrugated iron on it. She banged on this tin door with about 10 seconds to live. Amazingly, the door opened, she fell through, the door was clanged shut, and the bolt put across just as the guy hit it with the machete. On the other side was an 11-year-old girl. The 2 girls ran across the courtyard and into the house. The guy with the machete came over the top of the gate and ran and followed them. They'd gone into the house screaming. The owner of the house comes out and stands in the doorway with his arms folded. The guy with the machete screaming, "Give me the girl, I know she's in there." He said no. There was a standoff for a few moments. Eventually the guy in the doorway, whose name was Yahya, called the 2 girls out. And he stood holding the hands of both of them. One of them was his daughter, one of them was a girl who just clapped eyes on a couple of minutes before. And he said to the fellow with the machete, "You kill my daughter before you kill this girl." And he stood there. The guy with the machete looks around the yard and realizes there's other Tutsis in the same yard. He said, I can see you have a whole viper's nest here. You give me that girl now, or I'm going to go and fetch the Interahamwe, and we're going to come back and we're going to kill the lot. And he said, in the name of Allah, don't you dare. You killed a man on my doorstep yesterday. He was one of a very small minority of Muslims living in Rwanda. You killed a man on my doorstep yesterday. I want no more blood on my property. You leave or face the wrath of Allah forever. Guy backed down, never came back. Yahya saved 30 people in that courtyard. In 2004, I'm the project director of the Kigali Memorial Centre, building the new museum in Kigali. And I go to interview Yahya as a part of the project. So I said to him, Yahya, why did you do that? He says, well, it says in the Quran, he who saves a single life, it's as if he saves the whole world. He who kills a single life, it's as if you kill the whole world. I asked him if he knew that this very similar text was in the Talmud. He didn't know what the Talmud was. He knew that there were Jewish people. He knew that some of them had been killed in some war somewhere in Europe sometime, and that was about the extent of his knowledge. During the same project, we were going to mark the mass graves of those who were murdered during the genocide. Now, I had enough knowledge by this time of what had happened during the Holocaust to know that, for example, in places like the Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, and so forth, you go there today and try and find the graves, as is now happening a little bit with a project by a chap called Father Dubois, who some of you may have heard of in the Ukraine, but hasn't on the whole been happening. That many of those places are simply forgotten, lost, or maybe just roughly marked. Or maybe, as happened with me one day when I went back with a survivor from a town called Benjin, where we went to try and find his home, there was a new road right across the place where his sister had been killed, with no markings, nothing. He knew that because of his own memory, but there was no way to know that based on the new topography of the road that had been built. We knew that in Rwanda, those places were very quickly forgotten. So we did a research project to try and find out how many sites of execution there were in Kigali, just the one city. We found 862 sites of mass killing in the one city. We wanted to mark these so that they would be there so that actually when a new road is built or a new government ministry or some five-star hotel or whatever, actually in due course you would still be able to go to that site and say, this happened here, and know that in perpetuity for the benefit of the families and the victims. So the idea was to use GPS mapping technology. You would go to where there was a former roadblock or a mass execution, you would stand there, you would get a local history from the people that lived around it, because they still do live around it, and get a picture of what happened there, and find out who the victims were, so you've got a record. And then you would take your little bleeper and go bleep with the satellite, and then you've got the spot. You can put it on Google Maps, and you can develop a whole kind of project around that. So there we were. There we were. That was my phone. There we were in Kigali collecting all of this data, and we said to our IT guy, we now need to go and find a place that we can mark. So the IT guy says, oh, I know a place. So we get in the Jeep and we drive out of the city, and we go down a nice little lane with bungalows and verandas and stuff and lawns and roses. And I say to him, oh, this is very nice, Eve. This must have all been built since the genocide. Like new development, you know, there's been a lot of infrastructure and so on. He said, oh, no, it was always here, this little area. So that's very nice, very pleasant. We come to the last house before the fields and the palm trees and so on, and he stops the Jeep, gets out, takes his keys out of his pocket, goes to a gate in a brick wall. So I followed him out, and he opens the gate in the wall and walks through. And on the other side of this wall was a very nice bungalow with a nice veranda with rocking chairs on it, and a very neatly cut lawn with azaleas around the edges. So he goes to the middle of the lawn, takes out the satellite bleeper and goes, here, bleep. So I said, here what? He said, there's a mass grave here. So I said, who's in the mass grave? He said, well, my mum, and my dad, and my sister, and my cousin. Oh, and the lady from across the road, she was just sort of left in the street, so I thought I'd better bury her too, because there was no family left to bury her. I said, how old were you, Eve? Knowing this kid was about 15 years younger than me, he said, I was 13. I said, who lives here now? He said, I do. I said, who else? He said, no, nobody else. Went in the house, and the house was all neatly made, like his mother always left it, all the pots and pans and all the rest of it. His bedroom was a bit of a mess, as it probably had been all the way along. And the house was just exactly as it had been. The next day, we were sitting on the veranda with a camera, and I'd asked him if he wouldn't mind being interviewed for the museum. So he was telling me his story, and he described life in suburbia, more or less. Yeah, they weren't wealthy, they weren't middle class, they were just engineers. His dad was an engineer, worked hard, enough to buy a plot, enough to build a bungalow, enough to work hard a bit more and make a decent life for his kids. And he described how they'd there was a little minibus that would collect them at the end of the road for school in the morning. So sometimes his mum would take him and his sister and the kids next door. Sometimes the lady next door would do it. And they would kind of go to school, and he described that. And the two boys in the neighbouring houses were both into playing football. I nearly said soccer then, because I'm living in America now. I've got to get the terminology right. Football. They were into the football, so they'd go off to go and do that. And then the dads would sit on the veranda in the evening, have a beer and have a talk about what was going on and so on and so forth. We then get to the point where I say to him, so who killed your family, Eve? How were they murdered? Who did it? He said, oh, well, the man next door. I said, not the same guy who would sit on the veranda and have a beer with your dad? Oh, yeah, same fellow. He threw his 8-year-old sister down the well alive. I suppose I'd gone to Rwanda for that first time, and I was there for about a year the first time, but somewhere in my mind, in the back of my mind, unwittingly, certainly subconsciously, was there something that said something like, if it's going to happen somewhere, it's likely to happen in an African country where there's poverty and ethnic division, and these things are more likely to happen there than somewhere else. I came away from Rwanda, having spent already this time 15 years very close to the issues of Holocaust and genocide, not only very personally traumatized by the experience, and I say that as a professional, able to deal with the professional issues. I'm not talking about the personally, but with a very, very clear understanding that was life-shattering understanding, that if it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. And I don't say that without very long consideration. I mean, anywhere. 2006, Halima Bashir is a doctor. She's working in Darfur. She is Darfuri, which is unusual, actually, woman doctor working in Darfur. Working under the cover alongside the aid agencies. And she had an orphanage of school children which she was working with and looking after. The militia that were carrying out the genocidal killings in Darfur entered the school. And they raped the girls that were under her care. Most of them aged between 9 to 14 years old. As a medical practitioner and as a woman, to watch this and then to have to deal with it was the most traumatic experience of her life, because these girls were in her care. She felt responsible for them, and actually she was responsible for their physical, emotional, and psychological well-being immediately after the atrocity. She reported the crime to the aid agencies which got to the United Nations bodies. And information that she'd reported, it got back to the militia, who then returned to the school and said to her, "You've been talking about the rape. You want to talk about rape? We'll talk about rape." And they took her. And for 3 days, she was gang raped, but not killed. She was then returned to the school. Halima made it out alive, and she sat in front of a camera, another camera, this time one of ours, and she told a story. And she told her story on the condition that I would tell the story when I stood up and spoke in an audience like this, because although the shame of that was very great and the trauma of that continues for her, she wants you to know. Because she believes that if I tell you, or I show you her testimony, that we will do something with that. In 2009, I find myself at the University of Southern California as a new executive director of the Shoah Foundation. Shoah Foundation has 52,000 testimonies given by the survivors of the Shoah, 2,484 of them from Australia. They were given in return for a promise. That promise was undertaken by Steven Spielberg, who you remember produced Schindler's List and undertook to take these testimonies along with a very fine team of people, including Kim Simon and others, who 15 years ago went to 50 countries and worked in 32 languages to collect these testimonies in perpetuity. The promise was twofold. On the one hand, that they will be kept in perpetuity and they will be preserved for the future. That promise has been kept. At the University of Southern California, where that collection of testimonies is now based, there is a most amazing facility where those testimonies are digitized and are preserved, and our technical team will guarantee us down to a pixel that there will be no distortion of those testimonies from now as long as they exist, and they will be there for hundreds of years. The second promise was that those testimonies will be used to tell the world what happened and will be used to teach future generations. And that's a promise that we cannot fulfill because it's an ongoing one. I didn't write my thesis on anti-Semitism in Britain. I ended up writing it on Holocaust survivor testimony and its development over time, and in particular audio-visual testimony. And interestingly enough, Shoah Foundation was collecting its testimonies at the time, but I was kind of finishing as that was getting started, and so I managed, fortunately, to be able to contain it with one paragraph that said, "This is going on, and it's such a big project, I can't study it," which is just as well because I'd still be writing the PhD now. But I have taken an interest in Holocaust survivor testimony throughout the period, from then till now. I've been absolutely desperate to get into that archive, and for lots of reasons it's quite difficult, because it's not very accessible, because the responsibility that goes with that is a very heavy one, and it can't just be dispersed left, right and centre without some real care and attention. So I haven't actually had access to it until starting my employment 3 months ago, and now I can get to it through my laptop on my desk, which is very exciting, actually. But more than that, what I have discovered in that archive of testimony is an absolute treasure trove, which is the voice of a generation, which is, I would say, the compelling voice of our time, which not only says once, but says 52,000 times over what we all need to hear about that past. And that is, it's about individuals and their lives and what individuals go through when genocide occurs. The Shoah was a very particular type of genocide. It was the archetypal genocide, unfortunately. But contained within those testimonies are timeless truths which, if we can get at them, can not only tell us about what happened in the past, but can give us a very real moral compass for the future too. To be its custodian for just a few years of what will be its millennial life is a very real honour and very real privilege indeed, and one that I hope that I can do justice to along with the team at Shoah Foundation and people like Pauline and Lee and Mark and others who work with it here in Australia and others that work with it around the world to bring it to our attention. But why never again, yet again, as our title for tonight? I've just dipped in and out of really what are nothing more than stories in the life and times of genocide in our world. The figure is really not known in terms of how many millions of people were murdered by governments. Genocide, politicide, democide, whatever side it is, I don't really care. What I care about is that around about 200 million people who should have lived their lives out in full and died of natural causes were murdered by governments. Among them were 6 million Jews. The numbers are not relevant because the Nazis didn't murder 6 million Jews. They murdered one, and then another, and then another, and then another, and another, and another. It's not about the numbers, it's about the fact that individuals were murdered because of who they happened to be. Do I care about whether or not, definitionally, what's happening in Darfur is a genocide or not? Well, last year it was, this year it isn't, next year it will be again. What do I care about that? What does Halima care about that? The question is, are we going to use this compelling voice not to prevent genocide, but to change the way in which we think and we behave and we react? Unfortunately, my brother James still runs the Aegis Trust for Genocide Prevention, and he has a list of genocides that he's working on that haven't happened yet. And that isn't a genocide, that's people's lives we're talking about. When the Jews of Europe were faced with that event on the 1st of April 1933, which Armin Wegener could see with such clarity, they were not looking for other Jews to come to their assistance, and Armin Wegener knew that. And what's more, he thought he was part of a whole group of people that were going to use their voice. Little did he know he was the only one. Did he appreciate getting righteous among the nations? Yeah. Would he have rather not got righteous among the nations? How much more so? We are faced in our lifetime with the fact that genocide will occur soon. It will mutate, it will change, it will come again. And I guess the point of this evening's reflection is, when we know that is likely to be the case, and we know what we know about the past, and we know we have these voices from the past that tell us so much about what we need to know, the question is, what are we prepared to do? I end with one reflection. In the Memorial Hall at the Holocaust Centre in Nottinghamshire, there is a text that says, "He who saves a single life saves the world entire." It was put there before I spoke to Yahya, because I thought it was an important message for the many young people that come through there. And often I would get asked the question, and still have been asked the question, how is it that there were so few that spoke out and did anything to stop the Holocaust occurring? And for a while I tried to answer that question. Well, it could have been this, and it might have been that, and it might have been the other, absolutely all blah, blah, because I had no idea, really. And then one day, suddenly the penny dropped. It's the wrong question. In fact, how dare one ask that question? Why were there so few? Unless you know for certain unless you absolutely know for certain that you would be prepared to die, and your spouse, and your children, and your extended family too, for the cause of another person that is not really your responsibility, unless you know that for absolute certain, then I have no right to ask that question. The question has to be, if there are 17,000 righteous among the nations, or whatever the number is today, how were there so many? And what do I have to do to be like them? Thank you.